right, everyone, welcome. Before we begin, let's give a round of applause to Costa and his staff for another wonderful meeting. And we would like to thank the OCF, the Orthodox Christian Fellowship of Loyola, for coming to be sponsors and help with tonight's festivities. Tonight we are hearing from the very Reverend Archimandrite Dr. Simeon Johnson. It's a nice mouthful. Now, all of us, of course, know our beloved Father Simeon. He preaches every other week. He teaches classes at our church. But I wanted to give a little bit about his story so that for those that are listening online and for those that may not know a little bit about our beloved Father Simeon. Father Simeon Johnson has been serving at St. Andrew since November 2019. Raised in a nominally Lutheran family in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, his first exposure to Orthodox Christianity was a Greek great-uncle that he saw pray regularly. Later in confirmation class, he heard the word homoousion, or of one essence, from the Nicene Creed, which made a deep impression on him. This word, in the example of his great-uncle, prompted a search for a more complete understanding of Christ, which in turn led him to the ecumenical councils and the Orthodox Church during his first year in college. After graduating from the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee with a bachelor's degree in history and political science, he studied at St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary, from which he graduated in 1976. He was fortunate to have studied under the legendary Fathers Alexander Schmemann and John Meyendorff during his seminary years. This was followed by further years of study of Orthodoxy in America and ecclesiology. Father Simeon was ordained to the diaconate on February 16, 1980, and to the priesthood on August 16, 1981. He has served in parishes in Milwaukee, Minneapolis, and throughout the Chicago metro area, including St. George, the Annunciation Cathedral, St. Nectarios, and now here at St. Andrew. His move to Chicago was prompted by educational opportunities, but provided opportunities to serve and teach in our parishes. He specializes in adult religious education. On November 30th, 2018, His Eminence Metropolitan Nathaniel of Chicago elevated Father Simeon to the rank of Archimandrite. Since graduating from seminary, Father Simeon has also focused on higher education. He holds a Master of Arts in Russian and Modern European History from the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee, with a thesis entitled Russian Orthodox Clergy in the Duma and Senate, 1906 through 1907, A House Divided. He earned a Doctor of Philosophy in History in 2005 with his dissertation entitled Imperial Commission, or Orthodox Mission, Nikolai Iliminsky's Work Among the Tatars of Kazan, 1862 through 1891. Once again, his work was in Russian and Modern European History. Father Simeon also teaches at the local universities and has been a bulwark of our local metropolis. Father Simeon is the chairperson of the adult religious education of the total commitment plan of our metropolis, and we are very, very grateful that he is a member of our church and edifying us in everything that he does, from his prayerful presence, as we saw during liturgy this evening, to his classes that he teaches here, and of course for lectures like this. Father Simeon, we welcome you, and we are grateful to have you.
Of course, it's always dangerous to put me at a podium because everyone knows I can be very verbose. I like an audience and I like to work a crowd, so I have to be very careful. So, when Father Dimitri and I were speaking about this Lenten season, we figured we'd both speak, and our places on the roster were kind of movable. In other words, the outside speakers were given first choice on the dates, and then we would fill in the blanks and do what we can. So I know that we were trying to come up with topics, and mine was my so-called Lenten lifestyle, and I kind of put it into the topic we have today, which is really is Lenten life, my reflections and suggestions. So, it's been a long time. I've been a priest, this is my 41st year, and I think that many of the things haven't changed from the day one. When we deal with Lent, I hear the same things from 5-year-olds as I hear from 85-year-olds, and it's basically focused on one word, food, all right? What I can't eat. So you notice on my list, it is there, Lenten fast, but it's at the bottom of the list. That was not accidental, that was on purpose. So, I think that when we talk about Lent, there are a number of areas that we really have to focus on, that we should concentrate on in our Lenten journey to Christ's crucifixion and his resurrection on Holy Pascha. And I think the first area, of course, is that we really need to focus on worship. The Church provides us with numerous different worship opportunities during the Lenten season, and I'm happy to see more of you here tonight. I hope that as we go forward in the next few weeks with the Pre-Sanctifieds, we'll see more of you. So there are more opportunities to worship. So one, most of you are here, of course, on Sundays. The Divine Liturgy we celebrate is that of St. Basil the Great, which we celebrate 10 times a year. The 5 Sundays of Great Lent, the Eves of Theophany and the Nativity, the Feast of St. Basil, Great and Holy Thursday, and of course, Great and Holy Saturday on the very eve of Pascha itself. Now, I'm very happy we read the Anaphora out loud. I love the prayers of St. Basil. St. Basil's prayers deal with the theme of salvation history, creation, the fall, and redemption through Christ. And the theme we have during Lent is salvation history, creation, the fall, and redemption. It fits in. So St. Basil's words are marvelous. So when you're in church and you notice the service lasts a bit longer, listen to the words of the Anaphora, the prayers around the Eucharist. St. Basil is giving us a vision of God's creation and our destiny to be with him in the heavenly kingdom. So the first thing I would say when I talk about worship is the Sunday worship that most of us participate in, we have to pay attention to the prayers of St. Basil the Great. You know that we also have other opportunities for worship. So we have the service of Compline celebrating this parish on Mondays. Fridays in all of our parishes we have the salutation service, which of course is divided into 4 parts for the first 4 weeks, and then the complete version done on the 5th week. And what they do, of course, on Friday evening is they sort of introduce the idea of the intercessions of the saints, particularly the Mother of God. So as we move forward in our Lenten journey, we need the prayers of the saints to help us in the Lenten effort. Very important. So for me, of course, you saw my favorite service during the Lenten period, which is the Liturgy of the Pre-Sanctified Gifts. So I remember many, many, many years ago, before I went to seminary, I went to 1 or 2 Pre-Sanctified Liturgies, which were done at 9 in the morning, 6:30 in the morning, and of course that's a major problem because the service is an elaborate form of Vespers. When do we celebrate Vespers? They know.
Evening.
In the evening, all right? It's an evening service, and it's designed to really give us kind of a focus that all day we're thinking about what we're going to do in the evening. We're going to assemble and we're going to receive the Eucharist. Now you know that in our sort of discipline, the normal liturgy that we celebrate, either St. John Chrysostom or St. Basil the Great, during the Lenten period is not celebrated during the weekdays, except of course on the Feast of the Annunciation. Every time we celebrate the Divine Liturgy with the consecration of bread and wine, it's a celebration of the glorious resurrection of our Savior. If we did that during the weekdays of Lent, we'd break the mood of penitence. But we know that the heart of the liturgy is the reception of Holy Communion. In the Pre-Sanctified Liturgy, what do? At the end of the service, we receive Holy Communion to give us the grace of God to help us carry through the Lenten fast and the Lenten discipline. That communion has been consecrated either on the Saturday or the Sunday before, and then it's pre-sanctified and reserved on the altar until the celebration of the service. Now, if we were very, very, very good, we would follow the Typicon and we'd celebrate the service every week during Lent on Wednesdays and Fridays. During the 5th week, we'd celebrate it Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. And then we'd celebrate the first 3 days of Holy Week in the morning, because remember, during Holy Week, the cycle of time is flipped around. And night becomes morning, morning becomes day. But it is an evening service. It is a very solemn form of Vespers. And I mentioned that next week you should listen, there'll be an extra litany. So we normally don't hear the litanies for the catechumens in our practice, at least in the Greek Archdiocese in North America on Sundays. You would if you went other places. But we have the liturgy that catechumens during the service, because it tells us something about the time of the year that we're doing this and the focus on the year. So the catechumens are those who are taking instructions. This liturgy would be celebrated every weeknight if you went back to the church in the 7th and in the 8th centuries and after that. And it would have this form with readings. Did you catch where the readings were from tonight? They're Old Testament readings. They're Old Testament readings because the theme is salvation history, creation, the fall, and redemption leading to our salvation in Christ. So we begin with Genesis in the beginning and we move forward in the Old Testament. Well, if this was the sort of the church in the 8th century, after they were read, the priest or the bishop who celebrated would give instruction to the catechumens who are going to be baptized. All right? And then beginning next week, we pray another litany for those who are preparing for Holy Illumination. What's Holy Illumination? Baptism. It's baptism. So those would be the people that began Lent approved for baptism. Midway through, they'd go before the priest or the bishop. He'd find out they were following through what they were supposed to, and then they would be approved for baptism on Great and Holy Saturday. So one of the names, particularly in the Greek tradition, for the Great and Holy Saturday service is the first Anastasis, the first resurrection. That's the ancient baptismal ceremony of the church. So this service, the Pre-Sanctified Liturgy, was the final period of instruction for catechumens, those who were preparing for Holy Illumination, leading to their baptism. All right, so very important. This service is something that if I had my way, I would drag everyone to the service, at least one of them, make them see it, and then we'd talk about it so you understood what was happening. One of the things you noticed was, before the second Old Testamental reading, I came out with the lit candle and the censer and said, the light of Christ illumines all. It does, gives understanding and leads to holy illumination, which is baptism. So maybe the first element of our Lenten journey is participation in worship as a community that will go through Lent and then celebrate the glorious resurrection together. So those services, you should attend some of the weekday services. You should attend the liturgy of St. Basil the Great with attention. I'm hoping. All right. So I've already alluded to it because when we talk about worship, it kind of flows. I think we always have to remember that Lent is a prime time for education within the life of the church. What we're doing this evening is good. It's appropriate. It should be done in parishes. In my 40 years as a priest, I've been doing Lenten services, and then after it I have the educational focus, which is what we're doing corporately this year, which is very good. So you know that one of the things that arrived before Great Lent began was the catechetical encyclical of the Ecumenical Patriarch. Why do you think it's called catechetical encyclical? This is the catechetical season par excellence, and it's designed to sort of shift our focus that way. So it was sent online by the Archdiocese, by the metropolis. Some parishes read it, but it indeed sets the mood. Lent is a catechetical season that leads to holy baptism. Now, most of us are all baptized, but I think we also have to remember that that catechetical season also means an educational season. So it's a time that we're called to deepen our understanding of God, understand how Christ is human and divine, understand how he works out our salvation by becoming one of us, teaching us how to live, suffers and dies and is raised from the dead. So education has to be part of my Lenten effort, and I'd say your Lenten effort too. And we can do it a number of ways. So this class, these type of classes, there's a whole list of books that are available that will be basic theology. There's a number of readings that are meditations that are very nice. If you asked Father Dimitri or me, we can give you a list of those basic books you should be reading and books of meditations too. Some of the nicest Lenten meditations were done many years ago by, he's labeled as a monk in the Eastern Church. Well, he's the late Father Lev Gillet, who was basically a retreat master for almost the 30 years of his life when he was in London. But a very interesting person. I could tell you his story, but not today. All right. So the Lenten series, one of the things that we're doing very importantly, I'd say as a metropolis, is we have a webinar. All right. So last year we had a webinar that dealt with the feast days in the church. This year the webinar is on holiness, which is focusing first on the Theotokos and modern Orthodox saints. And our speaker is Dr. Helen Theodoropoulos, who will be next week's speaker here for our session. So that's something you should take time to do. I'm looking at Philoptikos members, and I know that on April 2nd you have a Philoptikos retreat. So that type of program is not just spiritual sort of focus, it's also an educational focus. So I encourage you should all attend the Philoptikos retreat on April 2nd, and the following week on the 9th, you will all be tuned in, I should say, to the webinar that Dr. Theodoropoulos will be doing. All right? So that type of thing. Read books of meditations. So this is also a time that I could sort of question you about your prayer life. I won't do it publicly, I promise. But, when I do the catechism classes here, and I've done them everywhere else, one of the things that we kind of end up with is we talk about what is life within the Orthodox Church, and I emphasize the rule of prayer. All right. So every one of us should have a rule of prayer. It usually is something which is done at a time which is best for us. All right. Either some people are morning people. Others of us are not morning people. So we have a focus that really should be done when it's our prime time. Rule of prayer is done. It should be brief and concise. The Trisagian prayers, Holy God, Holy Mighty, Holy Immortal, through the Lord's Prayer, should say the Creed, should have intercessory prayers, and then it should have our time to converse with God. All right? So during Lent, what we might do is lengthen that. Make it a little bit longer, because what are we doing during Lent? We're working our relationship with God. To work on a relationship with God means we spend more time with Him. All right, so time is a good thing. I would say that when we're sort of focusing on our prayer life, it should have elements of Scripture. So you all have wall calendars from the parishes, and maybe it would be good to read the daily readings. So of course in Lent they're all going to be Old Testamental readings because of this idea of salvation history. All right, but you could add maybe one chapter from the Gospels in that every day. Does that take a massive amount of time? I don't think so. All right, but it's something which is very important. All right, one of the other items that we really should remember is that there's the Lenten prayer of St. Ephraim the Syrian. So if we were doing this, the service of the Pre-Sanctified Gifts in a Slavic parish, they would recite it at one point during the Pre-Sanctified Liturgy. Our practice is not to do it, but at other weekday services, the prayer of St. Ephraim of Syrian is done. And I gave you one translation on there. O Lord and Master of my life, take from me the spirit of sloth, despair, lust upon idle talk. We cross ourselves. Okay. Give rather the spirit of chastity. Give rather the spirit of chastity. What do I have? Humility, patience, love to your servant. And then, Lord and King, grant you to see my own transgressions, and not to judge my brother, but bless him to the ages of ages. Amen. So there's 3 parts. End of each part, we cross ourselves and we make a bow. That prayer could be added. It doesn't take much time. I won't say much more on that because that is Helen's focus next week. And I want you to learn much from Helen on that prayer. Very important. So one of the other items during Lent, which is central, is sacramental participation. So we're having a conversation over there at that table, and we're talking about the Pre-Sanctified Liturgy is a great time for people to come to church and go to communion. It is. And it gives us the grace to go through the rest of the week. So we should be receiving communion frequently. So I remember when I was at seminary, Father Dmitri mentioned one of my teachers, Father Alexander Shmeman, and he said he had heard very many bad reasons for not going to communion, but he had never heard one good reason not to go to communion. So in other words, the notion is when the priest comes out with the chalice, what does he say? In the fear of God with faith and love, Did the priest say that? Those are the words of Christ. So, and of course, when you're invited to come forward by Christ, you should respond. The liturgy is a dinner. Now, if I went to your houses and was there and very friendly, but I refused to eat, how well would that go over with the hostess or anyone in the house? So when Christ offers himself, we should come forward. So frequent, regular communion, in my mind, means every time the Eucharist is offered, we should be ready to go to communion. All right? Confession. So I remember that, we know that there are a number of practices on confession. Many of the practices leaves much to be desired. So we know that the Turkish period in Greece, very few priests were really educated, and they didn't hear confessions. All right? So the unction service ended up filling in that because it's for the healing of soul and body and the forgiveness of sins, but it doesn't replace confession. Okay? Slavic practice tied one confession to each communion. I would say that is wrong. I would say the Greek practice of losing confession is equally wrong or bad. But what I would say is confession is something which is vitally important and has to be sort of revived and stressed. And really, when we go to confession, primarily we can go anytime, but the prime times to go to confession are during the penitential seasons. So the penitential seasons are Great Lent, Advent or the Nativity Fast, the Dormition Fast, and the Saints Peter and Paul Fast. 4 times, penitential seasons. But this season, Great Lent, is the prime time. I would remind you that there's a canon that says that every Orthodox Christian must go to confession at least once a year. That would mean that most of our flock is excommunicated. We don't want that. So I think that everyone should consider going to confession on a regular basis, particularly during this season and the penitential seasons, because we're supposed to be focusing on Christ, seeing the example he gives us on how to live, and looking at how we measure up to that example, not our neighbors. So I would say there are a lot of gaps in that, and we have to see ourselves, and we have to go on. There's a daily confession of sins if we wanted to do this in our daily prayers, but the notion of going, at least during the penitential season, to the priest, very important. He takes the place of the community. In the earliest church, people would tell everyone what they had done and be reconciled with the community. That would not work out too well in 2022, and the priest stands there as the representative of the community, hears the confession, and he can't forgive sins, but he can pronounce a form of absolution. The forgiveness of sins comes from God. But we recognize ourselves, see how we don't measure up, and how we should grow. So particularly, confession, communion. During Holy Week, we'll celebrate unction too, which is the practice which develops really during the Turkish period. Slavs do it, but kind of a little different timing. All right? So that's important. So I think that one of the things that we have to say is we have to really, during the season of Great Lent, watch what comes out of our mouths. Maybe silence is an appropriate thing. One of the verses for the Pre-Sanctified is, set a watch, set a guard over my lips, O Lord. And I think that, we're very quick to say things. We're quick to express judgment of other people, probably not ourselves, but others definitely. And the idea is we should refrain from that and really focus on ourselves, and we should be quiet more. Now, when I say be quiet, this is a very difficult thing for me because most of my life is based on teaching and talking and relating to people, but still, we have to watch what comes out of our mouth. All right? And I would say that probably the next thing is really that work of charity, philanthropy is essential all the time as Christians, but during the Lenten season, it's even more important. So I notice we have a food drive going on here, which is excellent. People should participate in it. This is the time that we should be feeding the hungry, visiting the sick, visiting shut-ins, be involved because we're the extension of Christ in those areas where there is need. So works of charity. And then, last but not least, yes, there is a Lenten fasting discipline. I did much better at the Lenten fasting discipline when I was 22. I am no longer 22, and my body needs a little different treatment. But I do change my diet. I try to avoid sort of meat at least and limit things. I try to make changes and substitutions. But I would say if you're not willing to do any of the other practices during Lent, you really shouldn't spend the time fasting or worry about it, because that comes after you've achieved everything else. Achieved maybe is a wrong word. You've at least attempted. All right. And I think that one of the things that we have to do when we talk about Lenten fasting or discipline, one of the things we have to understand is what's behind us. Eating is an issue of, yes, it's nutrition, it's what's needed for us, but it's an idea of dependence too. Are we dependent on the things, on treats and good things and all this? But ultimately, by fasting, we're to emphasize one thing in particular. Our dependence is on God Himself. Well, I tried to make it brief. If you have questions, I'm open. Yes. No, they'll give you recipes. I won't.
So, Father, I absolutely love your inversion of the paradigm, because so many Orthodox Christians, they put the focus on the fasting as the pinnacle, and you inverted it to say the reality is that fasting is, of all of them, it's kind of the bottom of it, because all the others are really more essential for us.
I had to do that once when Metropolitan Yakovitz was sitting there, and I said, now, the Metro here is least important. He agreed.
One thing that you really focused on is the frequent reception of communion, and particularly ordinary teachers that you had. Father Alexander Schmemann really revolutionized that. Yeah. And I was wondering if maybe you could share historically kind of what was the practice for most Orthodox Christians prior to Schmemann.
I think that the practice basically was in any ethnic group, in any tradition, fast, of course the fast was emphasized. The reception of communion was probably once during Lent, once during Advent, and very infrequently. Maybe some went to communion their name's day. So they attended the liturgy. There was no reception of Holy Communion. These services, which are Lenten, the liturgy of the pre-sanctified gifts, were celebrated at the crack of dawn. All right? No one was there. And even when we began the restoration, putting them in the evening, that wasn't the emphasis. But I think that part of it is that when you the Orthodox Church, canons of St. Joseph of Pretty send themselves to the Eucharist for 3 Sundays in a row. They're indicated, and they have to go to a priest to confession to return to. How many Sundays? 3? Okay, 3 Sundays. I think it sets the norm that kind of foundational period of the church. The norm was no question. Look at sort of where the church spread geographically in the Mediterranean and the Slavic lands. One thing you deal with is the Turkocratia, the Turkish period. Education virtually died in the church, and part of it, the church kind of becomes very insular focused. That idea of the missionary dimension, which had been there from the beginning, kind of withers, and the practice of the Eucharist kind of changes too. It becomes a kind of a formal external thing. With the Slavic church, particularly with Russians, Ukrainians, the proper term is the people of Rus. The ancestors of Ukrainians, Russians, and Belarus are the people of Rus, from Kievan Rus. All right, they dealt with the Mongol invasions. There was no education. The revival which occurs is kind of something which happened on Mount Athos in particular. Paisis Velichowski then spreads it to both Romanians and Slavs, and part of it is a recovery of the church's tradition as liturgical, as biblical, as patristic. And when you do that, you also revive liturgy and sacramental participation. So the revival came very slowly in the 19th century, and much of it didn't hit the Western world until, I would say, the 1960s. So, and I think some of you, you're all very young, but on the other hand, you might have some distant memories of times when people really didn't go to communion. It's not the correct practice. The correct practice in the church is frequent communion. Yeah.
Can you say again who this Mr. Schmemann is?
Well, Father Alexander Schmemann was. He was a profound theologian. He was a spokesperson par excellence. His specialty was liturgical theology. He was the dean of St. Vladimir's Seminary that I attended in the bedroom suburbs of New York for many years. And for instance, one of his works for the life of the world was done for a student conference, Christian, broadly Christian rather than Orthodox, and it focused each chapter is on one of the sacraments. So for the life of the world is kind of a common read that people should look at. And then he moved on to the Eucharist was his focus par excellence. He did a work on water and the Spirit, which was baptism. So he was a liturgical theologian. He was made a proto-presbyter by the Ecumenical Patriarchate by Patriarch Athenagoras of blessed memory.
And he wrote, he's the one who kind of transformed the Western thinking that we should.
He was a terrific speaker. And writer. So his sermons, he'd be invited, for instance, Sunday of Orthodoxy frequently. He'd be a guest speaker at OCF, college program retreats. When he was a young man, and he died in 1983. He was only in his early 60s. But anyway, his works have remained, and he's very important because it's beyond jurisdiction or ethnic groups. He writes to an audience which is primarily American.
And one of the things that he does that really ties into Father's talk is the allegory of we're all starving.
Yeah.
Like he really looks at the idea of fasting. We're starving ourselves and we're hungry for something.
What are we really hungry
and
for?
that was Schmemann's big question.
The
what
hunger.
are you really hungry for?
It's communion with God. Yeah. So I was blessed to be at seminary when he was there, and I will tell you a story too that I remember on Pascha. He and his wife Juliana lived about 2 blocks off campus, and just before the Paschal services, they'd come walking hand in hand. He'd be wearing a white cassock. Juliana would be sort of dressed to the nines too. All right, and he would come and then joyously celebrate the liturgy. Right, so it was an experience, and he was very close. We saw him regularly. He was one of my father confessors when I was at seminary.
Yeah, one of the things I was going to say about communion is the fast that you have to do before, right?
Well, yeah,
Doesn't that discourage people?
Well, I think there's sort of a mix-up on that too. So I would say if one only goes to communion once a year, I think you should fast quite a bit. All right, but the norm isn't that. Our Eucharistic fast is basically it's Wednesdays and Fridays are fasting days, and we shouldn't eat, before the Eucharist, sort of on a Sunday morning. However, I take medications. I don't know how many of you take medications. You have to follow your doctor's orders. The Pre-Sanctified Liturgy, the norm is that you fast after lunch. So I think we've made more of the fast than we, it should be. I think that part of it is the fast is designed to make us focus and understand, not to make us separate from Holy Communion. Yes?
It's kind of off topic of that, but...
Well, Anastasia, I've known you 25 years. You can ask me any question you want, yes.
No, just reading your notes and listening to you. So the Lenten was the final period for preparation for baptism on Holy Saturday.
Right.
So was there a period in our early church where there wasn't infant baptism,
Well, we're baptized with the ikos, with the household, and the household included parents, grandparents, children, servants, neighbors. So there was the idea, baptism of children occurred when there was a guarantee of a Christian family.
Okay.
Because the service we have is an adult baptismal service. That's why the sponsors recite the creed, make the promises, denunciation of Satan. But the service is an adult baptism. But the idea is the child will be nurtured and raised in a Christian family or household. If we don't have that guarantee, then we really probably shouldn't be baptizing. But I didn't say that, yeah.
Well, that makes sense. No, it makes
Yeah,
sense.
and what the practice was, by around the 3rd or 4th century, you had people who were admitted into the church that were Gnostics. The Gnostics believed in a body-soul dualism. They the body was bad, the soul was good, so therefore Christ could not take on human flesh. That's an absolute heresy, because we're saved by the fact that Christ takes on human flesh. We celebrate his incarnation on Friday with the Feast of the Annunciation. So, he works out our salvation in the flesh. He ascends to heaven in the flesh. So the flesh is essential. But because those people entered the church and then started to proclaim their teachings, what the church said, wait a second here. What we have to do is take a period of instruction, and by the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries, about 2 to 3 years of instruction, and the final period of preparation was the Lenten 40 days. Yeah. So we like education. Yes, Maria.
Sorry, you mentioned that the time is reversed during Holy Week.
Yeah.
What did you mean by that?
Well,
Sorry.
when do we celebrate Pascha? In the middle of the night. It's the night brighter than any day. So what we're doing is everything's switched around. So the holy services, the Matin services are in the evening, or the Orthodox service in the evenings. The Vesperal services are in the morning, and it's all moving towards the night greater than any day, which is the celebration of the resurrection. So the Pre-Sanctified properly should be done in the morning on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, only during Holy Week. Yeah,
You can correct me if I'm wrong. Okay.
I've been known to do that.
This is just a paradox of something that I've seen. Okay, so obviously being a Greek and an Arab, I grew up in this church, not this one.
Yeah.
Okay, and then I went to college and for about 15, 18 years got involved with Protestant churches, like where you teach and everything.
Yeah.
And then I came back a long time ago, because I'm older now, okay, 20-something years ago. But the paradox that this whole season is that, obviously, if you go to the more Protestant evangelical, they're filled with grace and everything, and it appears we're all works orientated over here. All these rules, don't eat this, don't do that, blah, 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 and everything. But what I found about this Lenten season is that it's an absolute paradox, because in all of this stuff, don't eat this, don't do that, it's filled with grace still.
Well, it's designed to make you think of what we're dependent on. So it's all those sweets, all that, although Lenten sweets can be quite elaborate and interesting, but the idea is that all these recipes we have are really focused on above and beyond. The Lenten food is designed to be simple, although it isn't always, all right? And the idea is to show us that our real dependency is not things, it's God.
And then, after I failed 15 times and had a hamburger at McDonald's or this or that,
Right.
it drives me to the point, by the time you get to Holy Week, do you realize I can't do it on my own?
No, we can't do anything on our own. It's
No.
the grace of God that allows
So
us
I'm
to
just
do
saying
it.
the whole paradox of it is it drives you to Holy Week.
Right. Well, I think baby steps are sometimes appropriate too. So I remember when I was first ordained, there was a family in my parish that the husband was Greek American, the wife became Orthodox, and his family had never fasted, right? Never fasted. And during Lent, what we did basically, I said, okay, so what we're going to try this year is we're going to fast on Fridays, and maybe we'll even fast on Wednesdays. There was kind of a growing and developing, and after that they began to fast more strictly than I do. My mother's an example. That my mother became Orthodox the year after I was ordained, and she fasted better than me, I have to say. Questions? Yes?
If you're in conflict with others, should you, smooth that over before you take communion? Or
Well,
are
you should be
allowed
doing
to
that
take communion?
constantly. You should be doing that constantly. Yeah. I mean, I would say that, it's kind of a human tendency to be in conflict with people, and we have to constantly try to overcome that. So you do your best to overcome it. And, one of the things I tell people is that, that what you should do is, particularly with people that you're in conflict with more, you should pray for them. Because what it does really is it takes that element of judgment from you and gives it to God. Well, of course, I know people that say, God, punish them. That's not the approach. But I think you should start praying for them. And that's a way to chip away at that. They may not receive it, but you can at least deal with it. Yes.
Yeah, so, we talk about failing, so I sat around a group of friends that were from the Catholic faith, and they all go, oh, I'm fasting from, this year it's gonna be chocolate, and this year it's gonna be such. And being told that you're not supposed to really say what you're fasting, that's within yourself and God. But then, in our group, there was this 91-year-old woman, she said, you may fail, it's not what goes into your mouth, it's what comes out. So I've used that constantly.
Yeah, I think you have to use that.
You say, oh, I had fasted for 40 days, I've done this, and yet you're terrible.
And when the Western Church begins Lent, they begin with Ash Wednesday and the placing of ashes. So of course, I never saw that growing up. I was kind of amazed. I guess my sort of tradition was Midwestern, clean everything up, scrub your sidewalks and everything. So I was kind of amazed I saw it. But that's a biblical idiom too. Sackcloth and ashes are appropriate. Ours is a different idiom. Ours follows the idea that your fasting should be in secret and no one should know.
And I love St. John Chrysostom's adage, what good does it do you to eat only bread and drink only water if in turn you consume your brothers and sisters?
Yeah.
That's a great one.
Yeah.
Who was the saint that ate hot sausages on the doors?
Oh, that's, if you've been to Moscow, there's the Church of Basil the Blessed, the Fool for Christ, which is all named Basil's in Red Square, which in my view is one of the ugliest churches that exists, because it's not a church. It's 7 chapels that are crammed together, all right? But the entryway chapel is the Blessed Basil. And the story is that during Holy Week, Basil, who is a fool for Christ, which comes out of the Byzantine practice, all right? He bought sausage, kielbasa, and he walked into the churches where all the nobility were, and they were explaining how strictly they were fasting, what their practices were, and he sat there and munched the sausage in front of them, and many of them did get the point. You should be quiet about this. And if you boast about fasting, it's a waste.
It reminds me of a story. I don't remember if it was Schmemann or Meyendorff that did it, Father. You can correct me who it was. But supposedly there was a week during Lent at St. Vladimir Seminary that was just really, really bad. The students were just devouring each other with judgment. And in that seminary, you knew who was going to preach. And so one of those 2 priests, I can't remember which one it was, decided to go to the cafeteria and had a hamburger. And all of the students were just aghast. In the middle of Great Lent, this priest, this professor, is eating a hamburger. And they do the service, and at the end of the service, the priest would always preach. And so they're like, what is he going to say? What's he going to do? He went up to the pulpit, and these are the words he spoke. You judged me. And he walked back in.
One of the things we also had was we had a student who was viewed himself as super Orthodox. So the Lenten practice with the cafeteria at St. Vladimir Seminary was the first week of Lent, the week of the Cross, and Holy Week were strict fast. There was no question about it. But during the other weeks, there were dairy products that were served. And we had one student who went and just stormed into Father Schmemann's office, slammed the door, and said, this is terrible. How can we fast like this? And he said, we deal with many people who have come into the Orthodox Church at varying times. They don't understand fasting. We're trying to give them a vision of it, and you are a hypocrite. Get out of my office. I never want to see you again. Well, he saw him again, but it was seminaries are kind of hothouses. I'm glad I was there, and I'm glad it's over. Anything else?
I was just going to say more of a comment. You reminded me when you spoke about people not taking communion. I can remember when we were in Sunday school, they did it on Saturdays at Easter and Christmas, and got it out of the way. There was times when I was an altar boy, the priest would come, offer the gifts, and nobody would come up. He'd turn around, come back in. And
I had the first liturgy I served was like that, and I kind of blew up at the end and said, I'll never do this again. And also the Saturday of Souls, I had a situation where no one showed up. And after the first Saturday of Souls, I had 2 people I knew in the city came who weren't parish members, and they basically did the responses. So on the Sunday I announced, I said, Well, we had a little problem yesterday. None of you came for the Saturday of Souls, and the bottom line is, if you don't come next week, it's not going to be a liturgy. I'll do the Trisagian prayers, and that's it. I never had that problem again. Yeah.
So I grew up like that too,
Yeah, yeah.
never taking communion, like
Right.
3 times a year, maybe
Right.
your
That's
name
right,
day
yeah.
the 4th time a year, and my parents.
And you're only 27, I'm amazed. You know.
26.
Okay, sorry.
But so when did what year did this change?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
when did the memo go out? And I missed that.
Well,
memo.
it's a
I'm still missing
it's
that
a
memo.
gradual process that began in the 60s and 70s. But it wasn't an announcement, it was kind of a movement towards a restoration of the church's traditional practice,
But-
which is frequent communion.
You know, but when I was growing up, which I'm dating myself here, in the 80s,
Yeah, yeah.
Even then people weren't taking communion every.
I
but
know,
something
I know.
happened. Like somebody got a memo
Yeah,
out
yeah.
to most
Well,
people.
I think it's, first of all, most of us have a seminary education, and we heard that in our classes. We saw it practiced, and I think that more of us encourage it in our parishes, and it's assumed that that's how it should be. So I think that once it begins, it's spread. And I think that we have a people who are actually hungry for the Eucharist, I hope. So the idea of a frequent communion is the norm. The aberration was the other practice. And in some cases it was kind of a piety behind it, but a piety needs to be informed. And I think that's what we're doing.
I think in my family situation, because we are from Asia Minor,
Sure.
that was very much the case.
Yeah,
I think they
yeah,
didn't know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
They didn't know at all, and that's why they kept it to
No,
3-4 times
I
a year.
remember in one parish there was a family that went to communion every time the Eucharist was offered, and the gossip, there
Yes.
must have been a murderer, he knew he was sinful. No,
They're not fasting.
That's right.
They're not fasting if they take communion.
All these people can't do.
that's right. But I think the practice in our churches for centuries was infrequent communion. The restoration comes gradually, really, and it comes out of this biblical, liturgical, patristic synthesis and revival that begins 200 years ago. When we talk about kind of a revival of seminaries, oh boy, that took a long time, because we're talking about something that really hits in the 20th century. So,
Father, I think of Father Gutelas of blessed memory, and in one of his classes like this, he said, you should prepare and you should receive communion as often as you can.
yeah.
And I
Yeah.
heard that and I thought, okay, I need to get my life in order.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And someone said, I was at an event and I didn't fast on Wednesday. I said, yeah, okay. Does that mean I can't go to communion? I said, could you control the situation? No. Oh, okay, well then come to communion.
But, Father, I think you are right about the education, because
Yeah,
I even remember reading Anna Karenina,
Yeah,
which
yeah,
was
yeah.
written
Yeah, yeah,
in the late 1800s,
Right.
and they only went 4 times a year.
yeah, yeah. No, that was the
Yeah,
practice.
that was like, you have to go 4
That
times
was a
year.
good practice 4 times a year, because
Yeah.
many of the practice was once.
And
And I think it falls with the Lenten.
But the unfortunate thing is because of that, and they got some of the Greeks saying that you had to fast the whole week.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Before the communion, and you had to have confession right beforehand. So basically what ended up happening was there were people that would basically go 30 years that
No.
never had confession.
No, and in
or
the,
had never had communion.
in the
rather.
Turkocratia, the Turkish rule, what? You had a confessor appointed by the metropolis of the diocese who was a circuit rider. When he made it to a village, and it could be Greece, could be Asia Minor, by the time he went to the village, it was 30 years in between. And when there's been no sort of notion of confession, it's lost. So it was the last missing sacrament. And then, people would say that then, since we do unction on Holy Wednesday, it solves the problem. Well, no, it doesn't solve the problem. I can understand it as a stopgap, but confession still is one of the sacraments of the church that must be practiced. And it's, I have to say that, I've been going to the same priest for confession for 25 years. And it's a good thing, because then the person actually knows you, knows what you're dealing with, et cetera, et cetera. It works out well, and it's a growing factor, because I can check how my behavior is, how I've changed it since my last confession. And also going to the same person, I can't get away with anything.
I don't want us to go too much in confession, because that's the focus of week 4.
Right. I know, that's why I mentioned it, but didn't go into depth yet.
He's just hoping to spread the load out since you'll have
Yeah, I think ideally, if we had planned this out, this one may have been first and everything, but we have to do what we have to do.
Exactly.
We have to deal with speakers when they're available, so such is life.
Be good host.
Yeah. Okay, other questions?
No.
Well, you know where to find me if you have further questions.
Well, once again, we know why we love you, Father Simeon, and why we are so grateful to have you as our second priest here at St. Andrew's, and we hope we will have you for many, many more years.
Okay, so we have a request here for all the college students.